Welcome to the Magnus. I'm Ben Brinner, professor in the Department of Music and the Helen Diller Family Director of the Center for Jewish Studies. I would like to begin by thanking our partners at the Magnus, that would be Francesco in this case, for the use of this wonderful location. As we're here for the annual Helen Diller Family Lecture, I'll begin with a few words about the Dillers and their transformative contributions to Jewish and Israel studies at Berkeley, as well as to many other causes. As some of you already know, Sanford Diller passed away at the beginning of this month, just 3 years after losing his wife, Helen, whom he met at Berkeley when they were both students in 1951. This is deep history. A compassionate and generous person, Helen helped further numerous worthwhile programs in the United States and in Israel. She deeply valued education and Jewish life and dedicated herself to sustaining both. Sanford played a major role in this, often behind the scenes, and these initiatives, which the two of them undertook, have already benefited many and stand to benefit many more for many years to come. If you've been reading the San Francisco Chronicle, you know that children are now enjoying a new playground in downtown San Francisco, and UCSF is about to get a new hospital building, both thanks to the generosity of Sanford and Helen Diller. At Berkeley Center for Jewish Studies, we too are grateful recipients of their largesse. They established endowments over 15 years ago that enable us to support students, faculty, and the Center for Jewish Studies itself to put on activities like this, events such as this, to bring in visiting teachers, to fund student research, and so on. So it's now, the Dillers, we really owe a tremendous amount to the Dillers. It's now my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Jeffrey Summit, a man of many strengths. In addition to rabbinical ordination, he holds a doctoral degree in ethnomusicology, which he earned at Tufts University. He's a research professor at Tufts, and he serves also as the rabbi and the executive director, the Neubauer executive director of Hillel. So many hats, or many kippot. This would keep most people busy enough for a full and very fulfilling career. But Jeff has also pursued research and advocacy in Uganda, where he is focused on the Jewish group, the Abu Yudaya. His recording of Abu Yudaya music was published by Smithsonian Folkways and was actually nominated for a Grammy, which is not a distinction that many other rabbis or even ethnomusicologists share. His work in Uganda has also extended to interfaith reconciliation efforts. This has resulted in another Smithsonian Folkway recording titled Delicious Peace, Coffee, Music, and Interfaith Harmony in Uganda. I just heard the backstory of that today, but maybe we'll leave that for the Q&A period so that you can tell it instead of me retelling your story, which presents the music of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim farmers who are members of a fair trade cooperatives. So this is just one trace of the tremendous energy that Jeff puts into things, and among other things, researching, teaching, and writing about social justice, in addition to his primary preoccupation with understanding, his primary ethnomusicological preoccupation with understanding the multitude of forms and meanings of the musical aspects of American Jewish religious experience. I should say also that one of the things I learned is just the astonishing array of Jewish denominational associations, trainings, and encounters he has experienced, the full gamut, pretty much. Rabbi Summit is the author of 2 major books on music and Jewish American life, and essays on a variety of other topics in several important edited collections. So his book, The Lord's Song in a Strange Land, Music and Identity in Contemporary Jewish Worship, was published by Oxford University Press in 2000. 16 years later, Oxford published Singing God's Words, the Performance of Biblical Chant in Contemporary Judaism. Over the course of the 20th century, scholars went to great lengths to study biblical cantillation, but their focus was almost exclusively on the musical formulas that the tropes represent, the ta'amei mikra. The melodies of different Jewish traditions were compared exhaustively, often in the hope of pinning down elusive commonalities in the deep history of divergent melodic practices. At the same time, generations of boys, joined later by many girls and then by adults too, were stressing out over learning to chant their Torah portion correctly, learning the sequence of melodic fragments encoded in the trope that were not written in the Torah scroll, and placing them correctly in order to stress the correct syllable. The stress on correctness, with the gabbai standing at one side to correct any slip, was, for me at least, a key element of synagogue experience at a certain age, as was bar mitzvah class age, where you would sit in the back of the synagogue with your classmates and wait to see who slips up. In his recent book, Jeff Summit has taken a different approach from the vast majority of scholarship by attending to the many aspects of the experience of Torah chanting. You will not learn the technicalities of cantillation by reading this book, but you will learn a tremendous amount about why and how this activity is so central to Jews of vastly different religious orientations, about the variety of meanings and motivations associated with this central act of Jewish worship, and about far-reaching changes that have taken place in recent decades. So we'll get a taste of this rich, multifaceted project in this evening's lecture, which is titled Singing God's Words, the Performance of Biblical Chant in Contemporary Judaism. Please join me and welcome Professor Summit.
Professor Brenner, thank you so much, Ben. It's such a pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this, and it's exciting to be here with you, a dear friend, and Rabbi Naphtali Kelman, who's also a Hillel colleague that we've been close over many years, other friends as well. So first, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to speak personally a little bit first. This book is very ethnographic, so I'm going to tell a lot of stories connected to it, and then I'll put them in a larger context. This book emerged after years of listening to Jews talk about their involvement in religious and communal life. And while the book considers the experiences of Jews across the country, the genesis of the book was very personal. Beginning in my mid-20s, my own experience chanting Torah, Haftarah, and Megillot felt transformative. When I was a bar mitzvah kid, I wasn't so transformed. But later on, even though I thought I knew the text of the Torah, every time I learned to chant a section, I came to know the words of the Torah in a different way, to know them for the first time. As a musician and performer, I'm used to singing and speaking in front of groups, but when I approached the bima to read Torah, something felt profoundly different than these other performances, and I started to wonder, did other people experience this as well? Jews don't talk a lot about God or religious experience. We're much more comfortable talking about community, religious observance, Israel, the Holocaust, or food. I seldom heard friends, community members, or my students discuss what they experienced when they read Torah, and why they devoted so much time and energy as they prepared to chant, because it takes a lot of work. When I started to ask these questions, I was overwhelmed with people's responses. In my travels around the country, this was research cross-denominational and done all around the country, I began to mention the topic of my book, and I lost track of the times that I had to pull out my iPhone and record people's emotional responses, what it meant for a father to chant at his son's bar mitzvah, the convert who finally felt Jewish after she read Torah, the person who developed an app so that he could study Leining Torah chanting on his smartphone. Stories piled upon stories. The woman who read Torah for the first time to celebrate her 85th birthday. The ambassador who said that as soon as his travel schedule calmed down a bit, his first goal was to read Torah in a synagogue. The owner of a major sports team who will remain unmentioned, but who owns the Boston Patriots, who cherishes the opportunity to chant the Haftorah in his synagogue on Yom Kippur. I lost track of the times that women began crying when describing what it meant to read Torah for the first time. There are many Jews who don't know how to read Torah, who don't participate in synagogue worship, or who are bored during the Torah service. I didn't write a book about them. I wrote a book about Jews across the country in every denomination who experience something transformative when they stand in front of the scroll of the Torah and chant sacred text, singing God's words. So I want to give a little background, and I think that people here are probably at tiered levels. Some people know this really well and have chanted Torah. Other people might not know exactly what is involved here. So chanting Torah is a mark of core cultural and religious competence, initially learned by many Jews, as Ben said, who prepare for their bar bat mitzvah, a ritual that remains a key rite of passage in the Jewish community today. More than half the Jews in America, according to a recent Pew study, learn and perform biblical chant. With this ritual, a young man or woman in liberal movements assumes new status in the community, able to lead prayers, be counted in a minyan, a quorum for prayer. Now, as many people here know, but not everybody, the vocalized text of the Hebrew Bible in a codex has both vowels to help you pronounce the consonantal writing of the words and the cantillation marks that indicate the melody to which each word is sung. But the handwritten parchment scroll of a Torah has neither. The highly detailed and musically nuanced performance of Torah requires that the reader memorize both the pronunciation of unvocalized text and the ta'amim, the ta'amei hamikra, the cantillation or trope signs that indicate the musical motif applied to each word of Scripture. And in many congregations, we know it's common for the rabbi or the cantor or the ritual director to chant Torah. But it's increasingly common, and I found this across the country, for congregants, members of the congregation, to prepare and perform this ritual act on Shabbat and on holidays. Many readers experience chanting Torah as one of the most powerful and personal and authentic ways that a layperson could put herself or himself in the epicenter of the service and perform their commitment to Judaism. Let's just get the sound of Torah chant in the room just to get it in our ears. So it's not the season right now, but I'll just start at the beginning of the Torah here, and we'll Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz va'aretz hayta tohu v'vohu v'hoshech al pnei tehom v'ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim vayomer Elohim vayi or vayar Elohim et haor ki tov vayvdel Elohim ben haor uven hahoshech Vayikra Elohim la'or yom u'lahoshech kara laila vayhera vayhivoker yom echad. Would anybody like to come up for the next aliyah? Okay. So just to get the sound. Okay, so in this talk, I want to talk about 3 snapshots from my research. The first snapshot is about the changing nature of religious experience in contemporary Judaism, is seen through the law of Torah, through the lens of Torah reading, where the experience of the individual increasingly takes precedence over community obligation and responsibility. It's a fairly radical shift in Jewish life, and it's happening all over the country, and it's not just happening in Judaism, it's happening in Protestant and Catholic traditions too. The second snapshot is a change in the impact of digital technology on how these traditions are taught and transmitted today. The third snapshot is on women reading Torah. I should mention that my research is drawn from about 400 ethnographic interviews I conducted with Torah readers in the Ashkenazi tradition. I focused on Ashkenazi. My wife is Sephardic, it's just Sephardic learning is very different, and I didn't focus on that. A lot of people weighed in on the issues that I discuss in this book. But before I go into those 4 topics, I just want to step back for a minute and sort of set the frame of how the act of Torah reading is such a complex site of cultural and religious performance. And it simultaneously embodies conflicting concepts, which is one reason I find this so interesting. Torah reading, and I'll play this out on both sides. Torah reading is both a symbol of ancient historic continuity on one hand, and very much an act of modernity on the other. So on one hand, historic continuity, it's the oldest part of the prayer service. And some scholars argue that reading Torah is the basis for the prayer service itself. While we can't trace the specific musical tunes of the trope back over the past 2 millennia, rabbinic sources confirm that the act of chanting text with a melody is an oral tradition that has existed for over 2,000 years. So Torah reading has remained remarkably unchanged over the centuries. That's on one side, ancient tradition. At the same time, Torah service is a fixture of modernity. The tradition is plastic enough to accommodate many contemporary rituals that engage contemporary Jews. The fact that bar and bat mitzvah has remained such a popular rite of passage has established the tradition as a contemporary performance for Jews today. And the surrounding rituals of the Torah service, the tunes for community participation, Debbie Friedman's Mishaberach, Blessings for Healing, easily accommodate contemporary expressions for spirituality. So ancient and very contemporary and modern. Another conflict. The act of Torah reading is simultaneously a site of conservatism on one side and liberalism on the other side. Torah reading, in terms of conservative, has to be done right. It's really interesting that when I interviewed, you'd think that, maybe Reform Jews are not so committed to, for Reform Jews, really, it's got to be done right. There's 3 things a Reform cantor told me that are important in reading Torah: accuracy, accuracy, and accuracy, right? So many liberal Jews are very, quote, conservative with a small c in their veneration of the reading and insistence on a respectful performance. Cross-denominationally, communities maintain a commitment to an accurate and meticulous performance of the text. For many worshipers, respect for the Torah is equated with respect for God, for the divine, as well as for Jewish religion and culture. But at the same time, many liberal congregants see this ritual as so central and rich with the possibility of greater experience that they're insisting on exploring new ways to perform and engage with the ritual. And this liberalism has led to innovative approaches to the performance of the text. Using trope to chant the text in English is increasingly common. Theme-based aliyot, where groups come up based on everybody who just graduated from college or people who just went through a transition. Even using innovations like bibliodrama, storytelling, creative midrash to make the Torah reading more meaningful and relevant. This liberalism has also led to women reading Torah, of course, first in the liberal movements a while ago, but now among segments of modern Orthodoxy to challenge traditional gender roles and lay claim to Torah reading. I'll talk a little bit about how in the left wing of Orthodoxy right now, of modern Orthodoxy, this is a big, big issue. Last conflicting thing. Torah reading is also simultaneously a site of elitism on one side and democratization on the other side. The performance requires detailed, esoteric Hebrew knowledge, musical, religious, cultural knowledge. And even then, careful study and practice are necessary when you prepare a reading. Anyone here who does it will tell you. Many Jews want Torah reading to be done right. But at the same time, when many Jews have come to understand the act of Torah reading is an especially meaningful way to perform their identity, more and more Jews want to participate exactly when the Jewish community is encouraging Jews to come step forward and be more engaged with community life. So as one rabbi said, the democratization of Torah reading means that you can't say to Mrs. Goldberg, your reading sounds like a chicken being eviscerated, because we encourage congregants to have equal access to this ritual, which in many congregations lowers the quality of performance. In addition, so many congregants have read Torah for their bar and bat mitzvah that even though the act is highly specialized, we found ways to make it broadly accessible to many, many people. So it's ancient and it's modern. It's conservative. It's a site of creativity. It's elite performance with broad democratic access. We have to look at many levels of personal experience when exploring what Torah reading means for contemporary Jews. So I want to go on to talking about religious experience in Torah reading. In the United States in the 21st century, worshipers across religious traditions are searching for meaningful experiences in religious life. It's not enough for people to say, when I was growing up, it was like, go to shul because it's the right thing to do. You have to, that does not work with congregants now. People want a meaningful experience if they're going to participate in synagogue. While cantors and rabbis are often professionally obligated to read Torah, and in some traditional congregations, accomplished Torah readers, Baalei Kriya, are hired to do this function, for lay congregants, the decision to chant is a personal decision. There's no obligation to chant. You do it because it's meaningful to you, because you want to do it. Well, the recent Pew study, as I said that more than half of American Jews have had a bar bat mitzvah. The core of that ritual involves chanting Torah or Haftorah, but there's no obligation to do it. You do it by choice. Learning how to chant Torah requires a lot of work and preparation, and in my research, I examined a range of the driving factors that make women and men decide to chant Torah today. In my interviews, I didn't do a quantitative study of how many people think were more people in congregations reading Torah, more lay people, but I did ask people, and the balance was about 6 people to 1 in all the people I interviewed said that they felt that there was an increase of people reading Torah, lay congregants reading Torah in their synagogues. So, in previous studies, when scholars posed the question, why did Jews chant Torah, they answered from historical and functional perspectives. They talked about how chanting makes the text easier to be understood, how the melody points to specific interpretations of the text, or how chant aids in the memorization of scriptures. We all know that singing something makes it more easy to remember. Why do I remember nothing that I learned in high school, but I remember every song that was popular and all the words from my high school experience? However, when I asked Jews across America why they chanted Torah, they didn't answer in the language of communal obligation or speak about chant helps interpret the text. Rather, within minutes, these women and men started to speak about core issues in their religious lives. Some viewed chanting Torah as stepping into a flow of Jewish history, a vertical connection back through time that linked them to something that was ancient and true. Others spoke about how the performance of Torah allowed them to experience peoplehood, a horizontal connection to Jews around the world, performing the same text at the same time, a visceral affirmation of their membership in the Jewish people. For many people, the nature of the experience was intellectual, and people spoke about how understanding and owning the Torah, and by extension their Judaism, happened in a much deeper way after they memorized the text. For many readers, chanting Torah was a personal connection to worship, much more meaningful than the prayers surrounding it. I talked to a lot of people who said, I come to shul for the Torah reading, like the prayers on board, but other readers spoke about how chanting Torah connected them to something authentic and real, enabling them to experience something larger, transcendent, something that many of them were willing to call God. So here's the first story I want to tell. This is from a 54-year-old woman, active member of a liberal congregation, businesswoman. This is how she described her first experience reading Torah as an adult. This is a long quote. Joyce says, "I was sitting in services and I literally heard the call, go read Torah. Whatever way I heard it, I was aware that I was given some instruction. So I went home and I put a date on the calendar. I worked and I studied. I knew my reading backwards and forwards. Now, I have to explain," she continues, "that the Torah that our community was using was a Torah that my father gave to our synagogue 20 years before in gratitude to God because my mother had gone through surgery successfully. So I was connected with that Torah. That Torah was part of my family. So," she continues, "I strut up to the Torah. Someone gives me a yad, a Torah pointer, and shows me where the reading begins. But because I practiced from a photocopy of the Tikkun, I had never actually looked into the Torah. I'll tell you honestly what happened. The letters started to dissolve off the page. The white was huge. The black was swimming. I was completely and utterly disoriented. I had no idea what the melody was. I felt as if I had fallen into a vortex of power. I thought to myself, I had no idea. This is a living, breathing entity, and it's taking me someplace very deep." She continues, "Of course, the community picked me up and someone helped me, found my place. The room eventually stopped spinning. I chanted. I sat down. But I thought, there's something life-changing about this experience." And here she began to cry. "Something's happening, the universe or God. What I understand now," she says, "is that I approached Torah with arrogance. I know you. I've got you down. I came before Torah with the wrong attitude. The next time I read Torah, I went there on my hands and knees, so humble. I said, 'You are a power greater. You are the living presence of God.' Now I understand. And my process of learning to chant the next time was totally different. It was a practice of humility, listening to a voice, a still, small voice." Isn't that amazing? This is why I write these books, because people talk like this, The sociologist of religion, Robert Bellah, recently wrote that participation in religious communities in America is less about loyalty and a strong conviction of membership, and it's much more about what will I get out of participating. So too, Arnold Eisen and Steve Cohn state that in American Judaism, quote, "the sovereign self reigns supreme." They explain how personal journeys and experiences, especially if they're shared with family members, or the stuff out of which their Judaism is now imagined and enacted, a Judaism constructed and performed one individual at a time. Even as the performance of biblical chant requires a minyan, you need a minyan to chant Torah, the solo nature of the preparation and chanting lends itself to an individual's spiritual journey and self-mediated definition of meaning. In the participatory music of the synagogue, Jews enact community, right? We sing together, we feel community. In the solo performance of chant, this woman learned the lesson of spiritual humility and experiences the numinous of God's holiness when she enters Torah's vortex of power. Now, while this ritual act puts Jews in intimate relationship with Scripture, they're performing values. This was a major realization as I did this research. It was like, oh my God. People are performing values that aren't necessarily connected with the specific interpretation of the passage they're reading, right? Of course, many readers understand the Hebrew well and use the trope to make the narrative come alive. But in fact, I interviewed many Torah readers who said they don't even think about what the words mean when they chant the text. Now, I gave this talked to a group of cantors. I thought they were going to throw things at me when I said that, because it was very disturbing. I say, don't shoot the messenger. I'm just the ethnographer. And Jews tell me how they actually experience the ritual, but something else is going on. So here's another example where a prominent anthropologist, a colleague, talks about the connection between Torah reading and the Holocaust. So, amazing woman, this is her quote from her. She says, when I'm reading Torah, there's something else that's always going through my mind. When I was a teenager, I went to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Israel. There was a photo of this girl in the children's pavilion, and I looked at her, and she looked exactly like me. And of course, she perished. So I thought, half my life is yours. When I marry, you're under the chuppah with me. When I have a child, the child is in your arms. I cry when I read this. So I think of her every time I read Torah, and she's reading Torah with me, and I'm giving her this joy. As an ethnomusicologist, I'm interested in how women and men express core values by the musical choices people make in their lives. If something larger wasn't going on here, why would these busy doctors and lawyers and professors and business people spend hours learning how to chant a section of arcane laws about animal sacrifice or genealogies? The Jews I interviewed described reading Torah as stepping into a stream of Jewish history, accessing a place of religious and cultural performance that felt truer and more authentic and more historically grounded than many other religious and cultural expressions. Whether they understand the text they're reading to be revealed by God at Mount Sinai, or a collection of Jewish wisdom and law redacted by generations of teachers, these readers become the voice that proclaims the story of the Jewish people, the voice that's chanting the tradition's core narrative. So that's the first part of my talk on meaning and on chanting Torah and meaning in people's lives. Here's the second section, which is on digital technology. I want to start off with two opposing quotes. The first quote is from an Orthodox rabbi in Los Angeles, okay? He says, a Torah is as low-tech as you could possibly get. It's parchment, for God's sakes, with cow gut holding it together. The fact that it's so low-tech makes it transcendent, eternal, timeless. Contrast this with the words of a teacher in an Orthodox day school in Boston who said, quote, whatever technology the kids are using, that's what tutors will use to have them practice more. It doesn't replace the bar mitzvah teacher. When I was growing up in the 1980s, it was a cassette tape. Now we have iPods and iPhones. In 10 years, we'll have, who knows, thought bubble brainwave music being beamed into your soul from satellites. And then bar mitzvah tutors will use that. So students who were born digital, my students, aren't asking whether or not they should use computers or smartphones or online resources when they learn how to chant Torah. As one college student said, I use technology for everything in my life. If there's a resource to help me learn this better, this isn't even a question, right? Technology is so deeply integrated into people's lives that no one is questioning whether computer programs, tablet computers, smartphone apps, YouTube videos, Skype, or appropriate venues by which to teach Torah chant. Here I consider briefly how digital media changes the transmission of tradition, affects the relationship between students and teachers, and challenges the authority of local tradition in contemporary Judaism. So let me take you back to, you'll know how old I am now, but I don't care. When I learned how to chant Torah and Haftarah in 1962, I sat in a small room in the basement of our synagogue with an old guy. He was probably younger than I am now, but when I was 12, he seemed old. Our ritual director, Harry Rearson, Alav Shalom, may his memory be a blessing. Harry would sing the trope to me, and I would sing them back as he taught me. And as he taught me, he'd write the trope marks, the cantillation symbols, on the blackboard in chalk. This was long before cassette tapes, computers, or smartphones. We heard rumors that in New York, I was in Connecticut, some kids were actually given 33 1/3 records with their Torah portion. In Connecticut, we had never seen such a thing. Let me contrast this with the approach of Debbie Lewis, the ritual director at Anshe Emet, a conservative congregation in Chicago, who teaches students how to chant Torah for their bar and bat mitzvah. She also works with all the congregation members who volunteer to chant on Shabbos and holidays. Debbie uses the computer program called Trope Trainer, a sophisticated program that allows students to listen to chanting of a recorded voice and follow the text of the Torah portion word by word. She refers to Trope Trainer as, quote, my Bible, with no irony whatsoever, explaining that she could easily find each student's section, listen to it in more than 20 different trope styles. There's a master's thesis right there. Like 20 styles, so it's interesting. They're not so different, except for the Mizrahi, the Eastern and Sephardic traditions. She could print it, she could hear the musical motif of each accent, and she could access a translation all on Trope Trainer. So here's what she does, and just keep track of the technologies that she uses. Debbie emails each reader 2 digital copies of the text they're chanting, one with trope symbols and vowels, and one just like the reading appears in the Torah. She uses her computer to customize print styles and type to make it easier for readers to see it. This is a big thing for kids with learning disabilities, where and I did a whole study on how people changed fonts to help it easier for kids who have trouble reading. Debbie records and emails each reader an MP3 file of the trope of their reading, stressing that this helps people understand the system of cantillation rather than just memorizing the portion. Readers download their files onto their phones, MP3 players, tablets, or computers to use to practice. Debbie values her relationship with students, and she requires them to be in contact with her by Skype, by phone, or in person to review their readings and get some live feedback. First-time adult readers are required to, get this, chant their Torah portion into her voicemail, or come in person a few days before, but she's dealing with a lot of people, so the voicemail is handy, so she could check their progress and offer assistance. Debbie discourages people from learning from a website or using programs like Trope Trainer on their own. She says, you never learn trope if you just listen to someone else's reading. While using many forms of technology in her teaching, count them, computer programs, email, MP3, Skype, voicemail, smartphones, computer tablets, digital media players, she's insistent upon regular student-teacher interaction, believing that's the only way a student will actually ever come to understand the system of the trope. In fact, so many forms of technology play into this process, then they're simply taken for granted by the students and the teachers. This is how people live their lives. This is the technology they use. People don't even question it. Rabbi Amy Morrison in Miami, who received a lot of publicity when she, I couldn't do this in my show, when she projected congregants' live tweets on a screen behind her as she was delivering her Rosh Hashanah sermon. Right, so she's getting instant feedback with the tweets on the, really, shoot me now. People talk, but she said, people talk about technology versus human interaction, but I see technology as human interaction, as a vehicle for human interaction. Let me go deeper into my personal experience. When I was learning how to chant Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, that has, as many people here know, different trope melodies, although the accent marks are the same. So here's how I learned. I met with my teacher, Ezri Uval, may his memory be a blessing. We would sit in the kitchen, his kitchen in Jerusalem, drink Turkish coffee, and discuss the text together. I knew how to chant Torah and Haftarah, but the Song of Songs was new to me. I had a high-end cassette recorder, and I still cherish the tape that he made for me with all 8 chapters of the book. I'd practice at home with the tape, but I'd come back with him about questions about unusual words, how it came to be that this love poetry was canonized into the Bible. In our colleague Tomie Han's book about the process of learning traditional Japanese dance, Tomie observes that, quote, transmission via the senses instills profound cultural beliefs in the body. So too, when one sits with a teacher to learn how to chant Torah, more is conveyed than the melodies of the accents. After 40 years, when I chant the Song of Songs, Professor Uval's voice still faintly guides me, phrase by phrase, through the text. The cassette recording was an important part of my learning process, but so were our discussions, his erudite Hebrew, his fascination with etymology, and the sesame cookies that his wife would bake and bring to the table when we studied together. What memories shape my students' experiences with cantillation as they sit with their laptops in their dorm rooms or any number of locations when students use technology without a teacher's guidance or supervision? Both teachers and students observed that the proliferation of online resources has challenged the importance of local authority in the Jewish community. Maybe you've heard the phrase, you know, when most people have a Jewish question, who do they ask? They ask Rav Google. Rav Google, and that's what people do now. The traditions taught by a community's cantor or rabbi have the imprimatur of an actual synagogue or denominational movement. Communities have vertical structures of authority. Traditions are passed down by established teachers or within families, generation to generation. But in a rootless age, congregants value traditions that, and in a rootless age, people want traditions that feel authentic and correct. At the very least, one could say they have the hechsher, the religious approval of being a tradition of a local synagogue. This is how my synagogue chants Torah. In contrast, digital technology has made authority horizontal. A web search for trope turns up systems of chant throughout the country and beyond. The majority of online resources in the United States are compiled by cantors and rabbis or congregants chanting various Ashkenazi traditions. And while they have a general familiarity, the specific connection to a teacher, a known teacher, to a place, to a family, to a particular Jewish community is lost. In a highly mobile society, some Jews see these associations as less significant. Students focus more on preparing for an individual performance when they're going to read Torah, and less on the transmission that frame and ground the ritual. These issues, the validity of authority, the role of the teacher in guiding and shaping a student's experience, a dislocation of learning from a specific time and place, a shift in community oversight and control. These are some of the core issues that we'll have to consider more deeply when seeing the impact of technology on chanting Torah. I want to move on to speak finally. Well, I want to give one more. I want to tell one more story about technology because it's so good. I don't want you to miss it. This technology makes text feel desacralized because it disconnects it from place. Because portable digital resources seamlessly bring the text everywhere and anywhere. It used to be the text, you know, classically people learned Torah chant after Shabbos dinner, sitting around the Torah. That's how my Orthodox family does it. The family sits down, we hear the boys all chant through the Parsha with like with their dad, or in Cheder in school. But now students could look at the text on a screen and listen to the recordings anywhere. One adult learner said, I have the recording on my iPhone and in my car. He said, actually, once it's on your iPhone, it's everywhere. Readers spoke about learning their Torah portions while going on a run, or on the elliptical machine in the gym, or in bed before going to sleep. Some readers felt that it didn't feel respectful to listen to your Torah portion while cooking dinner or getting a tan at the beach. Other readers felt differently, and they welcomed the portability of digital resources. And one could argue that technology allowed us to bring the sacred into the secular and enrich mundane aspects of our routine life. My early ethnomusicology work was with the Yemenite community, and it was very common for Yemenite craftsmen to chant Torah while they would work on jewelry or silver embroidery. And so they would bring the Torah into their everyday tasks. A cantor in Florida told this story. This was the one I wanted to especially share with you. Quote, I'm in my car. One of the ladies from my adult bat mitzvah class drives by me in her convertible. And she has the top down, and she's blasting me chanting Torah on her CD player, which is how she studies when she's driving alone. So I asked the cantor, what did he think of that experience? The cantor said, I think it's hilarious. He replied, and he said, it's great. Torah should be accessible, natural, not intimidating. If they could learn it on the run or get into it wherever they can, that's fantastic. Besides, he says, I see Hasidim in New York studying Talmud on the subway. What's the difference? How does it change one's relationship with Torah if you learn your reading in the car during rush hour? I would argue that there is a difference, actually. First, the material culture involved in learning Talmud on the subway is associated with certain values. You're holding a book. A volume of Talmud has cultural religious connotations. While the act of study occurs in a secular space, in a subway car, the line of vision from the reader to the familiar holy book encodes the experience as recognizable. Even the feeling of holding a volume of Talmud, the weight and heft, it has meaning. Well, the signs of and the sounds and sights of the subway are certainly different from a study hall, from a Beit Midrash, or one's kitchen table. The subway is an established site where individuals pursue their own activities alone together. On the other hand, listening to Torah portion in a convertible on I-95 has other connotations. Listening to the news or popular music on your CD player or radio, the joy or frustration of driving on a highway, the necessity to negotiate a range of distractions when paying attention to driving. So to what extent does the sound of the cantor's voice and the sacred material shape the context of the study experience? Portable music has increased the listener's agency, allowing people to create movable sonic space that blurs boundaries and cultural distinctions. That future is already well established, and both teachers and students of chant express concern that this delocation of sacred text from places associated with Jewish values will strip core associations from the experience of learning to chant Torah. So finally, I want to speak just a bit about women reading Torah. And I'll start with a quote from a professor in Boston. She said, once I was on the bima chanting Torah, and my daughter and granddaughters walk in, and the whole congregation hears my granddaughter yell, look, it's grandma singing. She continues, wow, this is feminist change, that a child's early memory of Torah is grandma singing. I interviewed many women who marveled at the impact of feminism on Jewish worship in the course of their lives, especially in regard to reading Torah. In fact, so many women are now drawn to this ritual that I heard rabbis and cantors in the conservative and reform and reconstructionist movements wonder aloud if women were taking over this role in their synagogues. A writer said, I'd hate to think that men have stepped back because women have stepped forward, but it's hard not to wonder if this is a connection. A rabbi in a renewal congregation said, quote, so many women read Torah, now it's a good week if we just have a couple of guys doing it. He observed that in general, women were much more involved in congregational leadership and ritual than 20 years ago, referring to this as the feminization of the American synagogue. He continued, actually, I don't mean feminized in a political sense. Our congregations have become much more womanized. He said, women are taking a more active and prominent role, and it's hard to get the men to step up. Rabbi Arthur Green, reflected, women have a long Women have a long tradition of exclusion in all fields. We belong to the generation that overcame that exclusion. Some women no longer feel anger or resentment at being excluded, but they still experience the joy of being welcomed back in. This is a very big deal in a lot of women's lives, especially for women of the generation who never dreamed that they'd be part of this. When a woman goes to vote, Art Green continued, I doubt that she thinks about how women couldn't vote until 1920. But in 1940, I imagine older women still did feel that. We don't have anybody left who remembers when women couldn't vote. But the power of the ritual occasion when we read Torah is so great that I think the sense of inclusion is fresh and meaningful to many women. A woman who chanted the Haftorah for the first time in her 90s said, quote, after all these years, it feels like such a privilege to read the words of the prophets. I almost cried. Every time I read now, I get the chills. There's a woman in her 90s who reads still actively in her congregation. A rabbi in a renewal congregation said, there's no better place for a woman to show that she's deep in the middle of the tradition than by reading Torah. It's much more important than leading prayer. We could argue about that, but it's a thought to think about. I spoke with women in their 60s and older who had grown up in traditional synagogues and whose first direct experiences chanting Torah came when they joined Reform congregations. For these women, simply having physical contact with the scroll was a powerful experience. And women spoke about feeling wholeness that they finally experienced when they were first allowed to touch a Torah. A woman who learned how to chant Torah later in her life began to cry when I asked her about the process of learning to chant. She said, when I first touched the Torah, it was like everything in my life came together. Many women who now belong to liberal congregations felt angry and excluded when they were growing up because they were denied access to such an important ritual because of their gender. One woman said, I remember thinking that there was a secret code and all the men up there knew it, and I thought, I want to know that too. I felt like I was missing part of my Jewish identity by not being able to read Torah. A woman said who decided to become a cantor after her first experience chanting from the scroll. A woman in a Reform congregation told this story, quote, she said, the cantor suggested that I might chant from the Torah. You have to understand, she said, I can't sing Happy Birthday on key. I told the cantor there's no way I could do this, but he made me a recording. I played it so many times in my kitchen, I swear the dog learned the Parsha. I basically learned it by heart. I could read it in Hebrew. Eventually, I learned the trope. I told my children, this woman's in Massachusetts, in Boston, I told my children they had to be there with me when I read. My son and his family flew in from California. When I actually stood up and read, I felt a sense of ownership that I'd never felt before. This Torah, it's also mine. It was very important that my grandchildren heard me read. Before I close, I just want to jump quickly to modern, or do you still have? Yes. Great, okay, great, okay. A couple more minutes and then we'll finish. I want to jump from the liberal movements to some observations about women reading Torah in the modern Orthodox community. The growth of modern Orthodox day schools and non-denominational Jewish high schools that include Orthodox students has raised a generation of traditional Jews who are committed to Orthodoxy, but don't viscerally relate to some core Orthodox prohibitions against reading Torah, like kol isha irva, that a woman's voice is licentious and sexually enticing, or kavod hatzibur, the concept that if a woman reads in a congregation, that's implying that there's no man in the congregation who's knowledgeable enough to read. So these are the two reasons that traditionally women don't read. A woman's voice is sexually enticing, and it might shame men in the congregation. I found that it's increasingly unusual for observant modern Orthodox Jews, especially those who go to university and work in secular professions, to accept and follow those prohibitions, and then it makes it harder for them to say that women can't read Torah in their congregations. It doesn't make sense. Some modern Orthodox women simply reject the idea that a woman's voice should be viewed as inherently sexual. My graduate student, who now teaches at Hebrew Union College, Gordon Dale, interviewed one Orthodox woman who said, "A woman's voice is beautiful, just like a man's voice is beautiful. You're supposed to say, 'Thank you, God, for making the world so beautiful.' Why does everything have to be so sexual? Don't you think you're making the world more perverse when you make everything more sexual?" Close quote. She went on to discuss the verse in Psalms, which reads, "All glorious is the king's daughter within her palace, kol kvuda bat melech pinima," and explained that this verse is often interpreted to mean that a woman's voice is acceptable as long as it's kept, quote, "within the palace," that is, quiet and cloistered. She continued, "But I'm not quiet, and I don't think that God intended me to be quiet." And this is an area of strong disagreement. I interviewed women on the right of modern Orthodoxy who hold by this prohibition of kol isha and understood it to be a statement of affirmation of the strength and power of a woman's voice. They saw their choice not to sing publicly as an important opportunity to exercise control over their inherent power as women. Center and right-wing Orthodox Judaism advance a strong belief that men and women are equal, but have different roles and obligations in communal and family life. Orthodox rabbis, as well as the women themselves, argue that certain synagogue practices aren't about privilege and power, but are gender-specific roles that have developed over centuries to support men and women as they build strong homes, families, and marriages. So there's arguments on, it's important to see how people on both sides see this. A rabbi, as one Orthodox rabbi in Boston observed, reading the Torah is supposed to unite us. On Shabbos, all Jews everywhere are focused on the same Torah reading. But in our little sliver of history, gender issues have become increasingly divisive. As traditional women negotiate these conflicting cultural and religious values, women's prayer groups and partnership minyanim, places where women chant Torah in sort of carefully negotiated settings, become important but also conflicted sites of religious, cultural, and social performance. This is how I'd like to end my talk. Here's my conclusion. Jews have strong feelings about music, really strong feelings about music. In the 12th century, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid interpreted the verse from Exodus, "God answered Moses with a voice," bakol, to mean that God taught the Israelites the melodies for chanting Torah. God taught us these melodies. So how we sing God's words has a profound impact on our relationship to Torah, tradition, and community. In the Talmud, Rabbi Eliezer tells about the story of one of his students who insisted on studying the Torah silently, without chanting the Torah. After a number of years, the Talmud relates, the student forgot everything that he had learned. So we sing the Torah out loud every week in order to remember our story, who we were then and who we are now, a narrative that's made real by the performance of the text. Thank you so much.